In the hills of Appalachia, where the mountains swallow the sun early and silence falls heavier than night itself, there exists a family name spoken only in whispers. Not because of fame, nor wealth, nor the greatness of a bloodline, but because of what happens when bloodlines coil in on themselves. This is not the story of survival. It is the story of collapse. A lineage born to a dead end, carrying secrets carved into bone, faces that seem to belong more to ghosts than to the living. Generations locked together, unable or unwilling to reach beyond the walls of their own kin. The photographs, when they surface, are difficult to look at for more than a moment. Faces blurred not by the camera, but by the deformities inherited through time. Eyes that do not meet one another, jaws that never quite close. Children who never had the chance to grow beyond the shadows of their ancestry. And yet, beneath the horror, there is something even darker. The knowledge that every feature, every twisted smile, is not chance, not illness, but choice. A deliberate closing off of a family tree until it bore only rot. For outsiders, it was a spectacle, something to point at, to laugh at, to dismiss as backwoods folklore. But for those within the family, there was no escape. Each generation bound by the choices of the last. Brothers became fathers, sisters became mothers. The bloodline folded again and again, until individuality itself began to vanish. What was left was not a family in the sense we understand, but an experiment without end, an echo chamber of human frailty and despair. The deeper one looks, the more the story begins to feel less like history and more like punishment. The land they lived on, isolated, unforgiving, seemed to mirror the prison they had built around themselves. Outsiders rarely visited. When they did, they returned with stories they would never forget. A home where silence clung thicker than the dust, where children played with hollow eyes, and where every face reminded you of the last, because every face carried the same blood. This is not merely the story of deformity. It is the story of a warning, a family whose fate became etched into the very definition of the word inbred. A family that reminds us of what happens when isolation turns into obsession and when love becomes something it was never meant to be. A family that was, from the very beginning, born to a dead end. As the years unfolded, the family became less a collection of individuals and more a living monument to repetition. Each birth carried forward the same features, the same struggles, the same whispered questions about whether this child would survive long enough to bear the weight of another generation. In most families, lineage is celebrated, names carried proudly across centuries, roots spreading outward like branches reaching for light. But here, the branches curled back toward the trunk, wrapping tighter with every passing decade until the tree strangled itself. The neighbors knew, they always knew, but in places where poverty is as thick as the soil and secrets are older than the homes people live in, knowledge does not bring action. To speak of it was to risk being entangled in it, so the stories lingered at the edges of town, carried in gossip, tucked into warnings for curious children. Don't wander too far up that road, don't go near their land. Fear and pity walked hand in hand, because though their lives seemed grotesque to outsiders, to them it was all they had ever known. There are reports, scattered like broken glass, of visitors stumbling upon the family homestead. Travelers lost on dirt roads, men chasing work in the mines, or preachers looking to offer salvation. What they found inside those walls was something between horror and heartbreak. Children who didn't speak, or who communicated only in sounds and gestures. Adults whose faces carried a sameness that made them seem less like siblings and more like mirrors. A world that felt cut off not just by distance, but by time itself. Doctors rarely came, and when they did, their notes carried the weight of disbelief. How could a family continue like this? How could the cycle have gone on for so long without intervention? Yet each report was folded away, buried beneath layers of indifference, as if recording it was enough. The truth is that society left them to it, watching from a distance as their bloodline decayed, comfortable in the belief that such a fate could never reach beyond the hills. But history teaches us that forgetting is never protection. What happened there was not contained. It spilled outward in photographs, in rumors, in the haunted eyes of anyone who crossed their path. And it forces us to ask a question that no one wants to face. What happens when a family becomes a cage and blood itself turns to poison? There is a kind of silence that only comes from generations of suffering, a silence so heavy it presses against the walls of a home until even laughter feels like a trespass. That silence lived in the halls of their house, in the cracked boards and broken furniture, in the way children sat without words, staring with eyes that seemed to belong to someone centuries older. Outsiders described the air there as suffocating, thick with something they couldn't name. It wasn't just poverty or illness or decay. It was the presence of a truth no one dared to say aloud, that the family had created its own prison and the walls were made of blood. The photographs that survived tell more than words ever could. A boy with a jaw too narrow for his teeth, a girl whose gaze drifts permanently to one side, her eyes unable to focus, brothers and sisters so similar that their differences seem almost accidental, as if one face had been copied and distorted again and again. These images are not just records of individuals, they are portraits of an entire lineage collapsing under its own weight. Looking at them feels invasive, as though you are peering into a secret never meant to be shared, yet impossible to look away from once seen. But perhaps the most chilling part of their story is not their appearance, but their endurance. Year after year they continued. Marriage was not a choice, parenthood was not a blessing, it was simply what happened, because it had always happened. Children born into silence, raised in silence, and then pressed into repeating the cycle. It is not the story of villains, it is the story of victims who became both jailers and prisoners of their own bloodline. There were attempts, faint and fleeting, to bring them out into the world. A teacher who noticed a child that could not speak, a doctor who tried to trace the family tree and found it circling back on its elf. But every attempt collapsed under the weight of the same realization. To break free would mean to sever the only thing they knew, family. And so, the silence grew heavier, the generations folded tighter, and the name became not just a name but a warning, whispered in every town around them. This was not progress, this was erasure. A lineage collapsing until it became less than human in the eyes of outsiders. And yet somehow still enduring, still existing, like a scar that refuses to heal. By the mid-20th century, the family's existence had become more legend than fact. Whispers spread faster than truth, and the details blurred into something between folklore and nightmare. Yet behind the exaggerations, there was always a core of reality that could not be denied. In those forgotten valleys, a bloodline had folded so tightly in on itself that escape became unthinkable. What outsiders saw as deformity was, for the family, simply inheritance. What was called monstrous beyond their hills was called normal within them. Generations of children were born into a world where the outside barely existed. Their games, their bonds, their marriages, everything happened within a circle too small to sustain itself. And so, what should have been differences between cousins, uncles, and siblings instead became sameness, a sameness that grew sharper with each passing decade. The line between family roles dissolved, fathers and brothers blurred, mothers and daughters mirrored one another, even names repeated as if history itself had run out of imagination. To the townsfolk nearby, the family became a kind of living ghost story. People told tales of eerie encounters, of faces staring from broken windows, of figures that seemed too familiar in their strangeness. Some laughed at the stories, while others swore they would never set foot near that house again. The family's land became a border, a place people avoided, not because of danger in the physical sense, but because of the unease it stirred in the soul. Researchers would later call it a case study in isolation, a rare glimpse into what happens when bloodlines collapse under the pressure of closed walls. But clinical words cannot capture what the photographs reveal, nor what visitors felt. To stand in that home was to stand in the aftermath of generations of choices that should never have been choices at all. Every creak of the floorboards carried the echo of children who had been born only to repeat the tragedy. Every face reflected the quiet horror of lives predetermined before birth. And yet, the family continued. Against all odds, against health, against reason, they endured. Their very survival became a kind of defiance, though not the kind that inspires admiration. Instead, it left behind a question more unsettling than any tale. When a family refuses to let go of itself, what exactly are they holding on to? If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Because by now, the story is not about strangers in some forgotten valley. It's about us, about the shadow we all carry when we look too closely at where we come from. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have tried to escape? Or would you have stayed, bound by loyalty, by fear, by love twisted into something unrecognizable? The further we dig, the harder it becomes to separate pity from horror. These were not monsters. They were children once, laughing in the dirt, chasing one another across the yard like any others. But the laughter was quieter, the games shorter, the shadows longer. Each child carried the weight of generations pressing down on their small shoulders. By the time they grew into adulthood, their paths were already carved. Their futures were not theirs to choose. They belonged to the bloodline. And the land held them there, as if the soil itself conspired to keep them bound. Narrow roads led nowhere. The forests closed in like walls. Poverty sealed off any chance of education, opportunity, or escape. Outsiders may have judged them harshly, but outsiders had choices. This family did not. In their isolation, the unnatural became natural. Brothers and sisters became couples, cousins became spouses, and when their children were born, the family line tightened once more, choking out any chance of change. Visitors described the atmosphere as one of haunting repetition. A child would enter the room, and you could swear you'd seen that same face moments before. Another would appear, and again the resemblance was uncanny. It wasn't simply that they were related. It was that the family tree had lost its branches, leaving only the same faces, remade again and again like a cruel echo. Yet what chills most is not what they looked like, but what they lost. Speech in some cases eroded until words became grunts or gestures. Curiosity dimmed into silence. Dreams, if they existed at all, never reached beyond the walls of their home. A family that should have been a constellation of individuals instead became a closed loop, spinning endlessly in on itself until time seemed to stop. This was not living. This was persistence without progress, survival without hope. A bloodline that had become less about life and more about endurance, a family not moving forward but sinking deeper into its own reflection. There comes a point where a lineage is no longer simply a family, but a relic. That is what this bloodline became, a monument to its own collapse, preserved in flesh instead of stone. When people looked upon them, they weren't seeing individuals anymore. They were seeing history made visible on the body, the bent bones, the drifting eyes, the twisted jaws. They were seeing the cost of decisions made long before any of these children drew their first breath. And in that way, the family became a kind of living museum, displaying not artifacts, but consequences. The saddest truth is that none of them chose it. No child asked to be born into silence. No daughter asked to marry within walls that had already suffocated her mother. No son asked to inherit the curse of carrying blood that had nowhere left to flow. They were, each of them, trapped by loyalty, by fear, and by the invisible chains of a tradition too powerful to defy. When people spoke of them in hushed voices, they forgot this. They forgot that behind the unsettling photographs, behind the faces that unnerved outsiders, were human beings who had no escape. And still, there were those who came, documentarians, journalists, curiosity seekers with cameras. They captured the family in flickering frames, turning private lives into public fascination. For the world beyond the hills, the family became a spectacle, a headline, a symbol of everything people feared about what happens when isolation festers. But for the family themselves, it was just another day, another intrusion, another reminder that they were no longer seen as people, only as proof of a warning. Over time, the line did what all closed systems eventually do. It weakened, it fractured, and it faded. The family's name became synonymous with inbreeding itself, etched into conversations far from the valleys where they once lived. Their story lingered in whispers in photographs tucked away in dusty archives, in interviews that still unsettle those who stumble across them today. And this is where the tragedy deepens, because what remains is not a legacy of strength or resilience, but of erasure, a bloodline that consumed itself until nothing was left but memory, a warning carved into history's margins that when love turns inward and walls grow too high, a family can collapse into itself until all that survives is silence. And so we come to the end of a story that was never meant to be told, a story hidden in valleys too quiet for the outside world to hear, sealed behind doors that rarely opened, carried only in whispers that grew heavier with each generation. This family, born to a dead end, left behind not a legacy of greatness, but a caution carved into bone. Their bloodline stands as proof of what happens when isolation becomes destiny, when the circle of family tightens so much that it strangles itself. The images remain, the testimonies remain, the silence remains. When we look at their faces, we are not just staring at deformity or tragedy, we are staring at the cost of choices made in secrecy, of lives lived in captivity, of futures surrendered before they began. The horror is not in their features. The horror is in the inevitability, that none of them were given a chance to be anything other than what they were born into. It is easy to dismiss them as monsters, as curiosities, as a grotesque spectacle, but the truth is far more unsettling. They were us. Flesh and blood, laughter and tears, dreams that never had room to grow. What separated them from the rest of the world was not humanity, but opportunity. And without opportunity, even the strongest bloodline will bend, break, and collapse into dust. Their story lingers because it forces us to ask questions we would rather avoid. What does it mean to inherit not only blood, but destiny? What becomes of a family when its only tradition is itself? And how far can a lineage fold inward before it ceases to exist at all? The family is gone now, scattered, dissolved into history's shadows. But their name endures, not on monuments or in books of honor, but as a whisper, a warning, a reminder that some truths are buried not because they are forgotten, but because they are unbearable. This is not a tale of survival. It is a requiem for a bloodline that was never allowed to escape itself. Born to a dead end, remembered not for what they achieved, but for what they could never become.